Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Feudal Future Podcast. I'm Marshall Toplansky.
I'm Joel Kotkin.
And today we have a really interesting session for you, talking about the world economy and the impact of climate change, weather changes on the business of agriculture and the supply of food. We are looking at it from multiple geographic perspectives today. On a hyper-local basis, we have A.G. Kawamura, who runs OC Produce. He's a third-generation farmer in Orange County and provides fresh produce to the marketplace. In the Netherlands, we have Jaap Hanekamp, who is a professor at University College Middelburg in the Netherlands and specializes in talking about food supplements. He's an expert that's quoted widely and works with research with both the Dutch and European governments on the food industry. And we have Ernie Goss. Ernie is the Jack McAllister Chair in Regional Economics at Creighton University, also kind of known as the Midwest's uber economist and economist.
I'll take that.
Well, welcome, gentlemen. We really appreciate your being here. This is such an important issue. And Joel, you want to start us off?
Yeah, I'll start it off with Jaap, and obviously be interested in AG and Ernie, what they have to say. But the Netherlands has always been known as probably one of the most progressive, eco-concerned countries in the world. And yet we've just had this enormous political and economic disruption coming from the agricultural elements in the Netherlands. What's happening in the Netherlands that's creating this upheaval?
That's a very good question. It actually revolves around the so-called nitrogen crisis. For years now, and that has been going on for the past 30 years, the idea is that the agriculture in the Netherlands emits too much nitrogen from livestock and other sources, and that is detrimental to the local nature we have in the Netherlands. Now, one word about nature. Nature in the Netherlands is a bit of a euphemism because the Netherlands, well, as they say, God created the world and the Dutch created the Netherlands. And that's sort of true in a sense that we have, for the past 1,500 years, sort of created more and more land, protected ourselves against the sea, and so on and so forth. So nature is a very much related to what we do in the Netherlands on all sorts of levels. Now, be that as it may, yes, we have a very intensive agricultural industry in the Netherlands, which is, although it's a very small country, as one comedian said in the Netherlands, it's small yet insignificant. and maybe it is, maybe it isn't, I don't know. But yes, we have quite an extensive agricultural industry, and by definition, agriculture emits nitrogen, which of course you don't want. You want to have it in the plants and in the ground, but it does. And the question is, why do we suddenly, for the past 5-6 years, focus massively on nitrogen? And that has become part of the recent provincial elections, is whether or not we should basically more or less kick out about half of the Dutch farmers because of concerns about nature. And that is a very good question, and that requires quite a bit of scrutiny, because for one thing, it is clear this is sort of a trial for how to regulate agricultural from a top-down level, from a governmental level to the local level. And people seem to get to understand that. They sort of understand, okay, this is sort of the idea that you can regulate top-down basically almost everything, including food production, which is quite an important part of what we do as human beings in this world, I guess.
Well, you're feeling that sense of government involvement in the Netherlands, and as you say, it translates down to the local level there. Let me just ask AG, who's working farmer. Are you feeling that?
And we should mention AG was also the Secretary of Agriculture for the state of California.
Oh yeah, okay, just that. So obviously you're intimately involved in both the development of regulations and the implementation of regulations, or have been. How is this playing out here?
Well, in California, I think we call it the land of good intentions. And in that, unfortunately, there's wonderful intentions of trying to move us in a direction of sustainability, move us in the direction of social justice, and all the different categories that those two encompass. And yet, at the same time, it seems like more often than not, those good intentions are driven from the top down, similar to the Netherlands, and without really good input from the actual stewards of the land, the ranchers, the farmers, the foresters, and we don't get a chance to really share that there are great advances, great opportunities to have more solutions in our hands. There's a very robust toolbox, and what's happening is you're seeing a demise in many ways, where farmers are leaving the state of California, ranchers are leaving the state, dairies are leaving the state. But why? And the question really is answered easily. It's so hard to stay in business in a state that doesn't really necessarily embrace you and support you. And this idea of a regional food supply, a national food supply, a global food supply, it takes something like COVID to kind of shake up the globe and see that the food supply is not really that predictably guaranteed. In fact, it can be very easily be interrupted by any number of things. And California seems to be in that category of not quite recognizing how important the capacity to grow food for the 8 billion people. I think there's a question lately: are 8 billion people on the planet? Is that a blessing? Is that a sign of human achievement, or is it a crisis in the making?
Well, the question is, do you solve the crisis by starving them to death? I guess is sort of the.
Well, and let's just chase out all the businesses while we're at it. Yeah. Why limit it to agriculture?
but that being said, there's tremendous resilience within our ag community as we use the tools that come into that are developing and maturing at this time. And yet, can we get them registered? Can we get them approved? Can we get them through a regulatory system that doesn't necessarily give us that heads up that you're going to get stalled for months and months and you miss an entire season? So I think our challenge in California is re-educating, if you will, the government and the public that it's in their best interest to be supportive of agriculture and all the things it delivers.
Well, Ernie, please tell us that there's some sanity in the Midwest.
It's leaving as the protagonist in Ernest Hemingway, for whom the bell the sun also rises. He said, well, it took off. It began slowly, and then it really took off. It took it quickly, and that's what we're seeing. For example, talking about ethanol, for example, ethanol is a very important industry here in the Midwest. For example, Iowa and Nebraska. Iowa's number one in terms of ethanol, which of course supports corn production, and Nebraska also number two, supporting corn production. And then Biden's recently enacted Inflation and Deficit Reduction Act, so-called Inflation and Deficit Reduction Act, calls for a reduction in CO2 emissions from these ethanol plants by 40% by the year 2030. Well, this means you've got to have CO2 capture and sequestration. Well, environmental activism has meant no. In other words, and recently the Iowa legislature passed a bill saying no to that, essentially, meaning that to get the capture of CO2 from the ethanol plants and then sequestration and delivery via pipeline, you got to go across farmland. Well, the Iowa legislature said you got to have 90% approval from all the farmers along the way to do eminent domain, which means it's dead. It's dead. Right now it's dead. It's going. Nebraska's doing the same thing. So the number 1 and 2 ethanol producers in the U.S. are apt to be out of business soon because of this, I would call it climate change activism. And it's really hurting it's not just in ethanol, it's across the board. For example, Mexico is now in the year 2025 says no to GMO corn into Mexico for the consumer. Now that's going to really hit the corn producers in this part of the country, and to the tune of potentially dollars per bushel of corn. And that's, I don't know if that'll be actually implemented, but if it is implemented, all these measures are just really driving down what the farmer's looking at, his or her future in agriculture.
Well, and at the same time, obviously the costs go up. Has to be passed on to consumers, so that we're looking at the continuation of inflation, which is what your point about the irony is that this is really fueling excuse the pun on ethanol. This is fueling an increase in consumer prices for food as well as fuel across the board.
And I would like to focus a lot on the fact that, we have people from three of the most important agricultural regions in the world, the Netherlands, California, and the American Midwest. What does this mean for developing countries? I mean, if you have higher corn prices in Mexico, governments used to fall for that kind of thing. Are we going to see some sort of impact, particularly on poorer people in our countries, but also particularly in the developing world? Is this a potential fallout from these regulations?
Yeah, Marshall, you talked about higher prices. We can also talk about scarcity of food, and we're already seeing it. We will see more of that, and it will be a lot focused in the less developed areas of the globe, and that's a real concern going forward. And I'm obviously, for one, and concerned for humanity, but also concerned for what it means to the farmer as well.
I was just curious, what percentage of for instance, Netherlands, when you export, do you export largely to developing countries or significantly to developing countries?
No. Most exporting products is actually within the European Union itself. So I think about 90%, but I'm not sure about the numbers exactly. But most is exported only to the European Union. We also import food as well. So it's sort of a cross-border situation for the Netherlands. Half of the country is farmland of the Netherlands. It's only 42,000 square kilometers in terms of land. So it's very small. And half of it is farmland. So no, we produce for the European market mostly, but the same as anywhere else. There is such an idea of surplus, such an idea of we have enough for ourselves and the European Union. We can sort of reduce the numbers of farmers easily because of all sorts of nature goals we set ourselves from Brussels and The Hague and other governmental centers. And there does not seem to be any real sense of the strategic value of food, which has always been the case. Food has always been a strategic value in itself. Feed the population, try to generate funds by importing and exporting and stuff like that. And we've seemed to have lost that. And that's interesting because farming in Europe after the Second World War was a huge problem. The Dutch could not feed themselves. So it was a massive program of intensifying agriculture to feed their own population. That was only 75 years ago. My dad is 92 now, still alive, and he still remembers that he had a massive shortage of food. And in a very short period of time, we sort of corrected that. And now we've sort of lost it again.
I wonder whether or not the life seems to go in cycles, and I wonder whether or not we're starting to look at today as kind of a tipping point. We've got the Ukraine crisis that's limiting the amount of grain coming in to Europe and the rest of the world, and we have these weather events like what we're having in droughts in the Midwest and in tremendous amount of rain in Florida, or in California rather. Do you think short term we're going to be seeing the system really stressed in terms of its ability to create the amount of food required for people?
It's hard to say. The thing in Europe is, as at least as far as I can see it, is that Ukraine war is a wake-up call by definition. And one way or the other, it's very hard to get people into their minds that is a problem which might have cascading effects on many different levels, and food production is the first one to be under stress and strain, which is completely obvious. And I found it always so surprising that the Dutch government sort of continued on this nitrogen crisis cycle and simply decided even to spend a large portion of the Dutch government's money on buying out forcefully farmers. And that's sort of, then you live in a dream world, basically. Then you live in a world which is not ours anymore because we have a war in our backyard.
Let me turn to AG and Ernie on this, because both of you guys are in climate stressed areas right now. Let's start with you, AG. What do you think is going to happen to overall production of produce and of agricultural output in California this next year with all of the floods we're seeing?
Well, again, the flood is localized. It's depending on what watershed you're in and whether the snow melt is going to. We're going to see some significant challenges in the next months ahead as that snowpack melts. But let me just back up a sec. The idea that the world has tremendous challenges, we can all agree to that. Is the glass half empty or is the glass half full? I think that's where you really need to understand. If you're pouring from a pitcher that's filled with fear, you've got a glass half empty, and you are going to talk about how horrible the world is and how we're destined for just an absolute collapse. But if you're pouring from a pitcher that has all kinds of solutions within it and an acknowledgement that we've come a long way, in whether it's 75 years or 100 years. 100 years ago, my friend that's still alive today, he remembers actually 80 years ago, plowing his fields with the horses. He didn't have tractors yet. We've gone from 1927, 2 billion people on the planet to 2002 in November last year, up to 8 billion. But if you're pouring from a pitcher with solutions, then you're looking at the world with a glass half full, and the capacity, this is maybe the most important thing, the capacity to feed the world. We have tremendous capacity to feed everybody on the planet and end hunger not in our lifetime, in weeks and months if we wanted to. We don't have the will to do that. Now, the minute we lose the capacity to feed the planet is the minute we move into scarcity and we move into a state of survival.
Yeah, I'd like to hear from Ernie on this too, because it's interesting. We're not going to get stupid, is your point, right?
And of course the Midwest is, along with I guess the Ukraine, the breadbasket of the world. So,
right.
Well, this start off with Malthus was wrong, and Marshall, you were right. It is cyclical, and we will come back around to sanity. But in the meantime, you talked about the drought in the Midwest. Believe it or not, it hasn't had that much of an impact overall. If you're talking about all the states that we survey here at Creighton University, and by that, these farmers can grow corn on a bowling ball. I mean, this is amazing what's going on in terms of genetics in seed, and that's continuing. We're now talking about 250 bushels an acre for corn, when it was not that long ago, a couple of decades ago, it was 150 bushels per acre. We're talking about farmland prices moving up from something like $8,000 an acre I'm talking about northern Iowa, to $25,000 an acre in northern Iowa. So the farmers see this, they see the potential. And as you said earlier, Marshall, it is cyclical. It will turn around, but this is going to be a tough time, in my judgment, for some countries that import a high proportion of their food from obviously from other nations.
No, actually, I totally agree. Farmers are incredibly resilient, and the fact that there are still Dutch farmers is absolutely boggles the mind, basically, that they sort of resist 50 years of regulatory stress, basically. I'm not worried about farmers. They're incredibly resilient and incredibly smart in developing new techniques, new technology, new ideas about how to produce food. I'm not worried about them. What I do worry about is that you see that, especially in the Netherlands and probably the US as well, is the development of expertocracy, which thinks they can sort of deliver new ideas to people who farm by people who never have no idea what farming actually is. Right. And I see this a lot in the Netherlands, where this whole crisis is sort of invented by the expertocracy based on models and some simple experiments. Say, we have a crisis, we know how to solve it. Farmers do this, farmers do that, or farmers simply leave. Whereas these expertocracies are not farmers at all. They have no idea what farming is. And that's where my worry is. I'm not worried about farmers per se, but I am worried about the expertocracy, which, especially in Europe, takes over almost anything without having any knowledge specifically about the fields they have a say about.
Well, I disagree very strongly.
AG,
Yeah, because I was going to say,
as the leader of the
AG has dealt
California.
with this more than anyone.
Exactly.
Well, I couldn't agree more about the expert, that I love that term. What is it? Expertology?
Expertocracy.
Expertocracy. But you know, we those of us that are old enough to remember the fable about the emperor's new clothes. You know, we definitely have the emperor's new food, right? And there's any number of ways that we can produce food from a rooftop, inside of a building, in a petri dish. Those are all wonderful new advances, and they complement the global food system, but not to the exclusion of everything else. When you shut down Sri Lanka, when you try and shut down and take away nitrogen from farmers in the Netherlands, of course, you say, well, wait a minute. If we just wait a couple of years, we're going to have nitrogen fixing corn, nitrogen fixing rice, nitrogen fixing wheat. We're going to have all kinds of tools to use. But the point is, let us have access to that toolbox. Let's make sure that we can continue to move forward at all these different levels, whether it's the regional food system or the bigger system that food feeds, you know, boatloads of grains to those that don't have it. And to think that Africa is not going to do a leapfrog and jump forward in its capacity to produce food, to think that we're not going to figure out how to produce significant amounts of proteins, for example, out of the ocean, or let alone any of these other areas, deserts. I live in the desert. You add water to any desert on the planet, and guess what? You can produce a lot of things. It's the most stable climate in the world are deserts, and maybe Antarctica too. But in those winter months in deserts, when it's not exceedingly hot, you can produce so much stuff. So our goal here is to continue to create abundance, isn't it?
Well, and abundance implies scale.
Yes.
So there's a lot of innovation, excuse me, going around, and this particular industry with artificially produced proteins, you know, 3D printing of food. But all of this strikes me as largely being at the laboratory level rather than at the scale level. Is that true? And which of these things do you see moving into?
I don't agree with that. I don't agree with that, Marshall. And also, I think I said earlier that Malthus was right. I meant to say Malthus was wrong, because we are seeing unbelievable advances in agriculture. I mean, we're seeing more advances. It goes understated and underappreciated across the globe about that. And back to the point, one of the points you're talking about in this part of the country, the doubling of the size of the farm from, say, 500 acres per farm, doubling the size from 1,000 acres to something like 2,000 acres per farm. And of course, the farm family is getting smaller. So the real challenge is going to be the communities in which these farms are in, meaning they're just fewer and fewer farmers and farm families out there. And what happens to these communities? What happens to the farmer and the farmer's dependence on local lenders, local equipment providers, and so on? That's one of the keys, and the government's not helping us. Back to the expertocracy, I guess it's called. They're, in terms of recently, we're talking about number of banks nationwide went from 7,000 to we're down to 4,000 in the U.S. That's hurting the farmer, and that's my fear. Right, that's one of my fears right there.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. But do you see that what you're saying kind of assumes that we're going to continue the efficiency trend that we've seen in farming using kind of the same basic operational model, right? You got a bunch of land, you got fewer and fewer people to work it, you have to come up with automation, you have to come up with capital investment to be able to make it work. That doesn't assume kind of a manufacturing operational model where you have food being produced in factories by not growing it in the ground, but using other means to be able to, as you say, grow corn out of a bowling ball. Is that happening? We read about these kind of whiz-bang science breakthroughs, but is that really happening? The idea, for instance, of growing chicken from genetic stock, which I've read about recently?
I think it's happening, not on a level where you can actually sell off large quantities of produce. But in Europe and the Netherlands, you have an opposite movement as well, is the organic farming idea, basically going back to, say, the end of the 19th century with modern technology as well, obviously. And that's the opposite movement you see as well. And the question is, of course, organic farming is in itself fine, but it only can exist because of the surplus production we have in Europe because of basically modern technology. So but on the other hand, Brussels and The Hague does subsidize organic farming heavily, and for probably reasons of greener, sustainable, and so on and so forth, which requires more land use, which does require more land to have a similar kind of production level. Now, as long as it's a niche market, it's not really an issue. But if governments decide that this is going to be the mainstay of food production, then of course we have a very interesting issue at hand, which we do not know how to solve, basically.
I think
you are doing this. You are doing organic farming in Orange County. What are you finding?
Well, I'm not actually anymore. I've walked away from that because we're using tremendous new tools that are organic certified. We're using biologicals. We have a lot of new tools that are really good. But for us in California, where I'm farming, the organic market has not collapsed, but it's lowered so much by so much competition. I happen to be the high cost producer area down here in Southern California. Our wage rate is, let's say it's $17 an hour, and you go across 100 miles south and it's $17 a day. And you're trying to compete with highly perishable, labor-intensive crops. It doesn't work that well unless you have tremendous marketing, which many of the organic producers do. The local grown group that has done wonderfully well because of COVID, regional local food shed producers, I've seen them have a great resurgence, and I think that complements the larger system as well. If you're producing enough strawberries to ship all over the country, and your next door neighbor's producing some delicious strawberries for the local roadside stand business and for the regional restaurants, these are all pieces of a bigger puzzle that you want to embrace and help all of them. You don't want to say, oh, we've got ours, we don't need that. We don't need the big guys, or the big guys saying we don't need the small guys. That's foolish to think that that's a strategy for anybody. I think embracing agriculture in all its dimensions is the goal here, because if we aren't successful, for example, you cannot possibly accomplish those sustainable development goals. For example, there's 6 or 7 goals on the SDGs that rely on agriculture doing well. The minute we're not doing
I totally agree with you, AG. I think it's sort of a whole perspective, a myriad of approaches you can take, and there's nothing wrong inherently with organic farming. I know quite a bit of organic farmers myself. What it is about is, in Europe at least, is trying to top down change everything into organic farming, which is, of course, creates a massive problem because we don't know how to do that. What we do know is that there's a market for organic farming in the sense of how it is defined by regulation in Brussels, and that's fine by itself. But we need this multiple myriad of approaches to actually move forward anyway.
I think that's true. And myriad approaches, if you talk about this part of the country, we're heavily capital intensive. And so the idea of organic farming, that's close to metropolitan areas. That's just a minuscule part of what's going on in this part of the country. And I think it's an important part, but somebody in Greenwich Village, New York, they see it as this organic, we're just going to change all of that. Won't work. It just can't happen. We're talking about farms now. Marcia, you talked earlier about this. These farmers, when one farmer retires, he sells his farm to the next door neighbor who buys it. Now all of a sudden can take his equipment and move from one end of the farm out for miles, and doesn't have to turn around and go back. In other words, we're talking about consolidation, significant consolidation. So the farms are getting much, much larger in this part of the country. At the same time, we're getting organic farms, which are valuable, of course, close to the metropolitan areas.
So basically, what we'd like to conclude with, this has been really fascinating, and it's, you know, it's amazing to me actually that it doesn't get more attention, except when the Dutch farmers protest. You know, we just don't hear about it. You know, part of the issue, of course, is that all the media is now even more concentrated in a few big metropolitan centers, and so, you know, the connections between agriculture and the population in general are sort of gone. I always ask the students, I say, how many of you have ever stayed on a farm? And basically every year there's fewer, because, you know, the parents' generation didn't go to the farm, and some now the grandparents' generation didn't farm. So given these political pressures, we'd like to ask each of you to sort of project what you think the future of agriculture is going to be, and whether you're optimistic or pessimistic about it. So maybe we'll start with you, Ernie.
I'm very optimistic. Now, not in the short to intermediate term, but in the long term, as we all know, food is the essential. And we're talking about a global economy now. We're talking about a global market, and we're talking about larger and larger farms. My concern going forward for the farm is what about the communities in which those farms exist? What happens to that infrastructure, and what happens to those communities? And do we have the sensitivity among legislators and decision makers in Washington and the capitals of the states to engage and do the changes that are necessary for the farm? That's my concern. It's concern among the legislators and those who make these regulations and laws.
AG, tell me there's some hope for California since I live here.
You know, I am always cautiously optimistic that, you know, we have opportunities in front of us, and we have plenty of places we can learn. It's not that we're the best producers of fruits and vegetables in the world, for example, or nuts. And we're learning that from our friends that are, once upon a time, we were teaching how to grow those things. Now they're teaching us how to grow things. This exchange of knowledge and experiences is critical. In California, I think it's really important to understand that the difference between grains and the commodity crops, and the difference between fruits and vegetables, then you throw in livestock in there as well, dairy at different scales, ranching at different scales. You know, the menu is set that there's all kinds of dimensions of production that need to do well. What goes well with irrigated agriculture, I'll remind you, is that the bulk of the food on the planet is not grown using irrigation other than what falls from the sky, right? By an enormous percentage. And in the Midwest, I think it's still 80% is rain-fed. In Africa, it's 90-something% still rain-fed. Not still, but rain-fed. Those of us who grow fruits and vegetables, it's almost entirely irrigated agriculture. And so it's hard to do a blanket statement, except for you look at just what Ernie was saying, the ability to produce under severe weather pressures is kind of key here. And most of us are actually doing amazingly well given these different things, whether it's drought tolerant plants, whether it's plants that can be underwater for a while and still, make it to market. These are remarkable times. And with every new challenge, you're asking the university system, the research system, the private industries to give us new tools, because we can see that the old tools aren't working. So we need to embrace those new tools. So optimism is cautious optimism is where I'm at. Only because I can see it. You can see it everywhere. And I wish the public understood that. I wish the regulators understood it, because they don't.
So, Jack, we started with you. Are you optimistic, pessimistic?
It's hard to say. I mostly agree with AG. I'm cautiously optimistic for one reason, perhaps only, is that farmers in the Netherlands, and I guess everywhere in the world, are fiercely independent people. And that's a strength. And that's also a weakness, and a weakness in the sense of how do you interfere? How do you sort of bring knowledge to the table to the regulator, which is almost impossible on an individual level? And what the farmers have learned in the Netherlands is you have to get together as fiercely independent people to bring interesting material to the table for the regulators and sort of be a discussion partner to the expertocracy, which does not know what farming is, but tries to regulate the farming systems through their scientific knowledge as far as they have it. And in that sense, in the Netherlands at least, but also other parts of Europe, you see a sort of a coming together of these independent people thinking together about the future of farming and the future of regulation. So that sort of makes me cautiously optimistic.
Well, gentlemen, we greatly appreciate your sharing your opinions with us. This has been fascinating. I learned a great deal from it, and hopefully we will come back to you in a future show and see how things have evolved. But thank you for being part of the Feudal Future podcast.
Marshall,
Yeah.
do we have a half a minute for one concept?
Yeah,
that I
sure.
think is
Go ahead.
important?
Go for it.
With COVID came an interesting designation that there are essential workers around the world, a whole category, a whole list of essential workers that were singled out and put designated that these are important occupations, important endeavors that keep the humanity moving forward. If those essential workers were to ever organize themselves, we could end immediately our immigration problems, for example, in the United States. If all the essential workers could have their own immigration policy, a green card, a pathway possibly, that would be pretty powerful. And because the world has already acknowledged that these are pretty important parts of how the world moves forward, why wouldn't they support that? Why wouldn't we create a different way of looking at what we're trying to accomplish in the years ahead?
That's a great perspective, AG. And frankly, immigration policy is not only critical to the agriculture business, it's critical to the continuation of a lot of middle-class jobs and industries, being able to find, we currently just don't have enough people who have the skills across multiple industries, things like plumbers and electricians, as well as farmers. And, how are we going to do that when we have, job openings that are going unfilled? So it's something tells me that we're going to need to revisit our immigration policy and accommodate this if we're expecting to prosper in the future. But again, gentlemen, thank you very much. We appreciate your time, and thank you for being part of the Feudal Future podcast.
The Feudal Future.